The damp chill of a 14th century morning clings to the moss-covered stones of a Rhine Valley cloister, where the air is thick with the scent of wet earth and the sharp medicinal tang of crushed herbs. History books often paint a picture of the Middle Ages as a short-lived, brutal existence where a person was considered ancient by 30, but the skeletal remains found in monastic graveyards and village pits tell a far more complex story of survival and vitality among women who reached their 50th, 60th, and even 70th years. These women, often dismissed by modern history as mere footnotes in a world of knights and kings, held a silent biological advantage that we are only now beginning to quantify through the lens of paleopathology and ethnobotany. They possessed a deep, localized understanding of what we would today call endocrine health, managed not through synthetic chemicals or sterile clinics, but through a rigorous and intimate relationship with the invisible flora that carpeted the European landscape. The secret wasn't tucked away in a dusty tome. It was held in the hands of the alewives, the village healers, and the Cistercian nuns, who understood that the transition into later life required a total recalibration of the body's internal fire. The misconception that life ended early for everyone in the medieval period stems from a misunderstanding of average life expectancy, which was heavily skewed by high infant mortality. If a woman survived the perilous years of childbearing, she likely lived long enough to face the exact same hormonal shifts that women experience today. However, the medieval woman's approach to the dryness, or the waning of the blood, was fundamentally different from the modern medicalized experience. They didn't view the cessation of the cycle as a disease to be cured, but as a shift in elemental humors that demanded specific botanical interventions. This is where the story of the invisible secret begins, not in the halls of the early universities where men debated Galen, but in the communal brewing vats and the enclosed gardens known as the Hortus Conclusus. One of the most potent elements of this secret lies in a plant so common it was eventually taxed into submission by the church, Humulus lupulus, or the common hop. Before the commercialization of beer, brewing was a domestic task, the domain of the alewife. These women spent their days elbow-deep in the flowers of the hop vine, handling the resinous cones, breathing in the dust, and absorbing the plant's oils through their skin. Modern science has recently identified a compound within hops called 8-prenylnaringenin, which is arguably the most potent phytoestrogen currently known to man. It is a molecule that mimics the behavior of estrogen in the human body with startling efficiency. While the medieval alewife wouldn't have known the word estrogen, she noticed that women who worked closely with hops rarely suffered from the vapors, the bone-deep aches, or the sudden flashes of heat that plagued others. The constant exposure to this botanical powerhouse provided a steady, transdermal dose of hormonal support that smoothed the transition into post-menopause. This wasn't a pill taken once a day. It was an environmental saturation, a byproduct of a lifestyle that integrated medicine into the very fabric of daily labor. Moving beyond the brewery, the medieval garden served as a living pharmacy where the invisible health of the older woman was meticulously cultivated. Take, for instance, the ubiquitous sage, or Salvia officinalis. In the medieval mind, sage was the holy herb, believed to save people from the very grasp of death. But for the woman over 50, it had a specific, practical application. The cooling nature of sage was used to combat the inner furnace that often flared up during the night. We now know that sage contains compounds that interact with the hypothalamus, the body's thermostat, helping to regulate temperature and reduce the drenching sweats that could lead to exhaustion and a weakened immune system. A woman in 1350 didn't see this as a luxury. It was a necessity for maintaining the stamina required to manage a household or a farm in a world that demanded constant physical exertion. She would steep the leaves in wine or press them into fats to be rubbed into the temples, creating a sustained release mechanism for the plant's essential oils. The secret also extended to the weeds of the commons, specifically red clover. Often disregarded today as a nuisance in a manicured lawn, Trifolium pratans was a staple of the medieval wise woman's repertoire. It is packed with isoflavones, another class of phytoestrogens that particularly target bone density and cardiovascular health. Skeletal analysis of older medieval women often shows a surprising lack of the porous, brittle bone structure we associate with osteoporosis today. While part of this is certainly due to the high levels of physical activity and the absence of refined sugars, A significant portion can be attributed to the consistent consumption of these isoflavone-rich greens in soups, pottages, and teas. They were eating their hormone replacement therapy in every bowl of stew, unknowingly building a skeletal fortress that would carry them through their later decades. The social structure of the time also played a role in how this knowledge was preserved and utilized. The crone, a figure now relegated to fairy tales and horror stories, was once the community's repository of biological wisdom. She was the one who knew which root to dig in the second week of autumn and which flower to dry in the shade to preserve its potency. This was a form of invisible medicine because it didn't look like medicine to the outside observer. It looked like cooking, it looked like gardening, it looked like brewing, but under the surface it was a sophisticated system of endocrinology. The transition from the wise woman to the witch coincides almost exactly with the rise of institutionalized medicine and the systematic removal of women from the healing arts. As men began to professionalize the study of the body, they dismissed these botanical traditions as old wives' tales, a derogatory term that successfully buried centuries of empirical observation under a layer of patriarchal skepticism. The loss of this knowledge wasn't an accident. It was a shift in the way humanity viewed its relationship with the natural world. The medieval woman over 50 saw herself as part of a seasonal cycle. She understood that just as the earth went fallow in the winter, her body was entering a period of cold and dry humors that needed to be balanced with the warmth and moisture of specific plants. This wasn't about staying young in the modern sense of erasing wrinkles or clinging to a youthful silhouette. It was about the tempering of the spirit and the body. They used Vitex agnus castus, the chasteberry, to balance the erratic moods that can accompany hormonal fluctuations, not by suppressing them, but by gently encouraging the pituitary gland to find a new equilibrium. This plant, which grows wild across the Mediterranean and was traded along the ancient silk and spice routes, was a staple in the infirmaries of the great abbeys. It allowed the matriarchs of these communities to maintain their cognitive sharpness and emotional stability, ensuring they could continue to lead and teach the younger generations. Consider the physical environment of the medieval woman. There were no synthetic lights, no processed chemicals, and no sedentary lifestyles. The sheer amount of weight-bearing exercise involved in daily life, hauling water, grinding grain, tending livestock, worked in synergy with her botanical intake. But even the strongest body will fail if its internal chemistry is haywire. This is why the secret was so vital. It provided the chemical foundation upon which a life of hard labor could be built, without the catastrophic physical breakdown we often expect today. When we look at the records of women like Hildegard von Bingen, who lived into her 80s and remained intellectually and physically active until the very end, we aren't looking at a freak of nature or a genetic anomaly. We are looking at the pinnacle of what medieval botanical wisdom could achieve. Hildegard's writings are filled with references to the viriditas, or the greening power of plants, a concept that encompasses both the spiritual and the biological health of the individual. She understood that a woman's health in her later years was directly tied to her ability to harness this greening power. The secret was also hidden in the fats they used. Medieval diets were rich in animal fats, but they also utilized seed oils and infusions. They knew that certain herbs were fat-soluble, meaning their properties were best extracted and delivered to the body through oils. They would macerate comfrey or mugwort in lard or tallow, creating thick salves that were applied to the joints. This provided a double benefit: the anti-inflammatory properties of the herbs and the protective barrier of the lipids. Modern transdermal patches operate on the same principle, but the medieval version was integrated into the morning ritual of getting dressed and preparing for the day's work. It was a holistic saturation that kept the invisible gears of the female body turning long after the reproductive years had passed. Furthermore, the fermentation processes used in the Middle Ages acted as a force multiplier for these herbal secrets. Fermentation breaks down the tough cellulose of plants, making the medicinal compounds more bioavailable. The small beer that everyone, including women and children, drank throughout the day wasn't just a way to avoid contaminated water. It was a continuous delivery system for fermented herbs. Each batch of ale was a unique decoction of whatever was growing nearby: ground ivy, yarrow, dandelion, all of which contribute to liver health and detoxification, processes that are essential for managing the hormonal clutter that can accumulate as the body ages. The liver is the primary organ responsible for processing and excreting excess hormones, and the medieval woman's constant intake of bitter fermentable greens kept her liver in peak condition, preventing the sluggishness and toxicity that often characterizes the modern experience of aging. We must also talk about the rhythm of the hearth. The medieval home was centered around a fire that was almost never allowed to go out. The smoke from these fires, while often detrimental to the lungs, contained compounds from the specific woods being burned, often oak, beech, or birch. The tannins and resins in the smoke had a mild antiseptic and astringent effect on the skin and hair. But more importantly, the heat of the hearth was used to slowly cook the infusions that would be taken throughout the winter. There was a patience to this medicine. It wasn't about an instant fix. It was about a slow, steady accumulation of health. A woman would start preparing her body for the winter months in late summer, drying the berries of the hawthorn to support her heart, and gathering the roots of the valerian to ensure deep, restorative sleep. This seasonal foresight is something that has been completely stripped away by the convenience of the modern pharmacy. The tragedy of the invisible secret is that it was largely an oral tradition. It was passed from mother to daughter, from elder nun to novice, through the rhythm of shared chores and whispered advice over the steaming pots of the infirmary. When the witch trials swept across Europe, the primary targets were often these very women, the ones who knew too much about the power of the plants, the ones who didn't need the burgeoning male medical establishment to tell them how to manage their own bodies. The Malleus Maleficarum and other inquisitorial texts specifically targeted those who used charms and potions, which were often nothing more than highly effective herbal remedies. By labeling this knowledge as demonic or superstitious, the authorities effectively severed the link between women and their own biological heritage. But the bones do not lie. When researchers excavate the sites of old villages, they find women who lived long, active lives. They find evidence of healed fractures that suggest a high level of care and a robust recovery capacity. They find teeth that, while worn down by the grit of stone-ground flour, don't show the systemic decay associated with the nutritional deficiencies of a society that has lost its way. These women were the beneficiaries of a secret that was hidden in plain sight, in the hedgerows, in the gardens, and in the fermentation jars. They knew that the invisible health of a woman over 50 was a garden that needed constant tending, a fire that needed the right fuel, and a vessel that needed the right tempering. They didn't just survive the Middle Ages, they mastered the biology of the era using the tools that nature provided in abundance. To understand this secret is to realize that we have traded a deep ecological intelligence for a narrow chemical one. We have traded the alewives' hops and the nuns' sage for standardized prescriptions that often ignore the individual's connection to their environment. The medieval secret wasn't a single plant or a magic spell. It was a way of being in the world that acknowledged the constant flux of the human body and sought to harmonize it with the viriditas of the earth. It was a dense, complex, and incredibly effective system of self-care that allowed the crone to be a pillar of her community rather than a patient in a clinic. It is a legacy written in the very soil of Europe and in the resilient skeletons of the women who walked it centuries ago, waiting for us to stop looking for a miracle cure and start looking at the ground beneath our feet. The secret is still there, growing in the cracks of the sidewalk and the edges of the woods, invisible only to those who have forgotten how to see. If you want to understand how to apply these specific botanical rhythms to your own life, or learn about the exact ratios used in these ancient medieval infusions, stay tuned as we continue to unearth these lost protocols. This isn't just history. It's a blueprint for a different kind of future. Check the links in the description to find our deep dive guides on medieval herbalism and how to reconstruct the Hortus Conclusus in your own backyard. Don't let this knowledge stay buried. Reclaim your biological heritage today.